Welcome to the Cosmic Busker. My name is Bobby Codey. This video is the woke left, Greek sodomy, and Aryan Persia. This is going to cover an article from a leftist professor at Cardiff University. Let's see if we can get to the title screen. Here it is. Name of this particular article is On the West's Demonization of Ancient Persia. As we'll see at the end of this video, this comes from this professor's book. He's a professor at Cardiff University. As you see, his name is Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. And as the subtitle says, Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones unmasks the Philhellenic myths that made Europe. Philhellenic refers to Greece. The Hellenic, when one refers to Hellenic, they're referring to ancient Greece. So that's what that's referring to. As you see here, it was posted yesterday. That would be April 14th, 2022. I'm going to go over this particular article because it represents a lot of the myths and misconceptions that the left has about world history. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the article. It's a good article. The information isn't bad. It's the interpretation that this leftist professor makes because he has a whole bunch of misconceptions about world history and apparently about Persia too. I mean, he's a specialist in Persia, but he has quite a few misunderstandings about Persia that are shocking, but to me, they're shocking, but once you understand all the misconceptions, it's not that shocking because people have this complete misunderstanding of ancient history, world history, and current history as well. And I'm gonna do my best to correct some of those misperceptions that are propagated in this article. So let's take a look. Article begins, and this is directly out of the book. As I stated at the end of this video, we're going to talk about the name of the book, and so you'll be able to get the book yourself and perhaps read it. Appears to be great information, bad interpretation. So let's see what we got here. Professor states from around 550 BCE. 550 BC, or BCE as it's commonly referred to nowadays, the age of Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE. Each successive generation of Greeks had its own particular way of reconfirming, as needed, Hellenic identity or Greek identity against the ever-changing yet ever-present Persian threat. What I'll do right now is I'm going to throw up it's actually over that way. I'm going to throw up a map just to give you a sense of where Greece is and where Persia is as well. Close to each other. I'm doing this off the top of my head. They're both in the Mediterranean. I think is that the Adriatic that's between them? I think it might be the Adriatic, although the Adriatic, I think it was Italy. Doing it off the top of my head, I don't have a map to look at. But, Persia and Greece are right next to each other, typically access each other by the sea. It was also possible for them to go through land, but they would have to go through a whole bunch of, they have to go north and then south, north, then east, then south in order to go by land, and I imagine that would be a lot difficult because I think there's mountains there as well. It might have been the Caucasus Mountains there. I don't think so. But let's continue. They're essentially, the Greeks and the Persians had a long history of fighting, and that's what this represents. Now, Persia is modern-day Iran for the most part. Persia was an empire, so it went beyond what are now the boundaries of the current Iran, the nation of Iran. So it was much larger. Azerbaijan, Armenia, even parts of Greece were, I believe, taken over at certain times by the Persian Emperor. That may be incorrect. Even northern India, Afghanistan, all of these nations at one point were part of the Persian Empire, or various incarnations of the Persian Empire. It wasn't just one Persian Empire. Continually, over and over again, Persian empires fell, and then typically they were taken over by nomadic tribes from Asia, which we'll talk about in this article as well. I'll get into some about those nomadic tribes, because those nomadic tribes from Asia weren't Asian. They were akin to the Europeans, and they essentially spread throughout the entire world for the most part. And it's why we get this misconception nowadays from the woke left of white supremacy. They don't quite understand world history and what happened. We'll get to that, though. Let's continue. We're going to continue right here. The Greek obsession with the Persians focused on minimizing their credibility as a superpower. Denigration of the Persians by vilification or lampooning was intended to cauterize the wounds of anguish and fear provoked by the threats and realities of being neighbors of an empire whose territorial ambitions were very real and which showed no sign of ever abating. Let me take a sip real quick. Persians and Greeks were dire enemies. The Persians made several attempts to take over the Greeks, never completely could defeat them. There were some defeats, but they never were able to completely subdue the Greeks. Let's continue here. See what this says at the top. We're actually going to start right here. In order to increase Greek morale, a series of what might be termed cathartic images were created on stage, in sculpture, and in other arts. These disparaged, degraded, and belittled the Persians and confirmed Greek, especially Athenian, preeminence. Athenian was a reference to Athens, the Greek city-state from which democracy initially stemmed from. The Greeks invented democracy, you might say. Let's continue where they talk about this particular object. One such object is a red-figured wine jug dated to the mid-460s BCE, known as the Eurymedon vase. It shows a humiliated Persian soldier bending forward from the waist. His backside is offered up to a grubby Athenian squatty who stands with his erect penis in his hand, rushing forward in order to penetrate the Persian's rear, sodomize. So this is a vase with an image of a Greek warrior, or squatty as he refers to him, about to sodomize or penetrate the butt of a Persian POW, prisoner of war. The painted rape scene, for that's what it is, was created as a commemorative issue at the time the Athenians celebrated a victory over Persian forces at the Battle of the River Eurymedon in Asia Minor in 467 BCE. It was used at some kind of drinking party, probably a soldiers' get-together. And as the jug was passed around, a group of hoplites, the Greek equivalent of GIs or basic soldiers, so the wine flowed and the dirty jokes began to fly. So too was the Persian on the vase manhandled from soldier to soldier. So, they pass it around and say, hey, look at the Persian. The Greek soldiers would pass around this jug full of wine. Hey, look at the Persian getting raped. Ha, 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 ha. Oh, those weak Persians, and, on and on and on. So that's what this is referencing. Let's see. As each drinker gripped the jug, he played the drama of the scene. Now I am Eurymedon, he boasted. Look at me buggering this Persian. Buggering is a reference to the act of sodomy. It's one of the reasons way back in the days, I think that's the reason why people call it, he's a bugger. That's what they were referencing, buggering, sodomizing. The vase image is a perceptive visualization of soldiers' humor, although it is highly likely that the scene reflected a lived reality. After all, the post-battle rape of defeated soldiers has never been just a drinking game fantasy. The Eurymedon vase was an expression of the Athenian zeitgeist of the 460 BCEs. It was a well-aimed joke on recent, unexpected, but fortuitous political and military events, which demonstrated the natural superiority of the Greeks over the barbarian Persians. And he's talking about that from the Greek perception. There's a natural superiority of Greeks over the barbarian Persians. The Persians weren't barbarians. They were an empire, very civilized. And he's saying from the Greek perception, these Persians were barbarians. In fact, they were very civilized, and so was their empire. Where does this image of a humiliated, defeated, defunct Persia take us? It takes us directly to the era of the European Enlightenment, when intellectuals began to theorize as to why the West had become so dominant in the world order and had been so successful in the spread of white civilization. They came up with a radical theory. European superiority came not from Christianity, as had previously been thought throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, but from a cultural tradition that began in ancient Greece. Now, this is important because I just want to use this to expound a little bit. It had been initially thought that Christianity is why Western civilization, and it's Western civilization, it's not white civilization. It's a silly leftist type of propaganda that seeks to tie, because nowadays it's like white man and white civilization. It's a way of denigrating civilization. In fact, they're denigrating everything that makes them. They're just, people leftists who use this type of white man and white civilization. You live in white civilization. You're in the forest so much that you can't see that there are trees all around you. They have no idea that they're condemning themselves. Aside from the fact that most of these people are white genes, they don't even understand that everything they do and everything they think and their ability to question and criticize comes from white or Western civilization. It's an irony that they don't seem capable of understanding. But there's an important couple points I want to go over. Right here we see it says, European superiority came not from Christianity. This perception, and I hate the European superiority or domination is really what it is. It's important to talk about what type of zeitgeist Christianity inculcated into Western civilization. Jordan Peterson talks about this, and I have to admit that much of my understanding of this comes from Jordan Peterson. It's actually up there. I'm going to put up a link to Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel, so you can take a look at it if you haven't seen his lectures. They're amazing. I've listened to hundreds, if not dozens, of his lectures because he's one of the brightest and most insightful individuals I've ever come across. Christianity, but the influence of Christianity on Western civilization cannot be downplayed, because one of the most important aspects of it is the individual. Jesus, as an individual, according to Christianity, he was crucified and died for your sins. So essentially, this one individual, this one man, based on his actions and what he was able to do and what he was able to promulgate, was able to take on the sins of the world and offer salvation to the entire world. Wow. And he died, and he suffered, and he was tortured for that. Wow, okay. So that means the individual is preeminent. This one man could take on all the sins of the world and offer salvation to the world. One man, one individual. Why is that important? Because it's Western civilization. It gave Western civilization that ability to understand that everything boiled down to one basic element, the individual, the importance of the individual. And this eventually, over time and slowly, led to individual rights, individual freedoms. And it's important. I used to teach and I used to tell my students, you are not taught the proper way to think about the United States. You know, we have a bad history with regard to our empire, our continued expansion at the cost of what are called indigenous people. I do that because it's a stupid word that has no real meaning other than race, leftist racism. But I'll put that aside for now. But what the United States was able to do is for the world is something that is just incalculable, and it's so important. The United States Revolution that saw us, the United States, break away from British Empire, was one that in our Constitution saw and put in words and on a document as the founding principle of the United States that the individual was preeminent. The individual rights are preeminent. We had freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all these different individual rights. Where did this come from? Ultimately, it came from a theological perspective. It came from this one man, Jesus, who was able to take on the sins of the world and offer salvation. One man, one individual. So this showed that the individual was preeminent, and ultimately it led to the individual rights and civil rights that were put down in black and white in the Constitution. And once this happened, in the United States, had this United States Constitution where individual rights were set down as the founding principles of a government, it set the world on fire. All over the world, there were revolutions. And these revolutions were about people taking over and understanding that they had individual rights as well. The United States, everybody was emulating the United States in their revolution and seeking to institute a government founded on these principles where individual rights were important. Before the king could just decide, I'm going to torture all these people, and boom, they're tortured. Now let's round up all these people and torture. With the Constitution, individual rights, this was no longer possible. People could speak without fear of being harmed. They could practice their religion without fear of harm, freedom of press, all these different rights. Again, all stems from this one man, Jesus, who showed that the individual mattered with his own life. Okay? Now, as it also talks about, as it priests have been throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, but from a cultural tradition that began in ancient Greece. Yes, there's no question about it that much of Western civilization harkened back to Greece, where democracy was first instituted in Athens, as I stated before. And there were a whole series of Greek thinkers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, etc., that informed Western tradition. No question about it. These were brilliant men who instituted various thought processes that helped to push Western civilization forward. But we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment. And even music. Trying to remember who did it. I think it was Pythagoras who set out the system of the European scale of music. Matter of fact, for those musicians who are familiar with the different modes, Ionian mode, I'm drawing a blank right now on all the different modes. There's Ionian mode. There's a whole bunch of different modes of melody. All those modes are named after areas of Greece. Ionia is a part of Greece. I'm trying to remember the other modes. I can't remember off the top of my head, unfortunately. So let's continue. The Greeks, they invented freedom and rationality, according to this author is saying, according to those who promulgated Western civilization. They say that the Greeks invented freedom and rationality. Rome then spread these precious gifts across Europe in a series of civilizing imperial conquests. Other cultures on the fringes of Greece and Rome were barbaric, and the worst and most threatening of all barbarians were the Persians with their quest for world domination. This was contrary to the natural order of white supremacy. Now, this is where it gets ridiculous, and I want to push back on what he's saying there. And this is one, it's like, God, these people don't have a clue about anything. Excuse me, thank you. He has a misunderstanding of Persia. It's hard to understand where he gets this from, because it's completely backward to reality. What he's saying is that Greece and Rome were this white area, and that Persia were these brown people or something, and that's why it was contrary to the natural order of white supremacy, because those Persians had to be barbarian because they're brown peoples. They weren't, okay? Persia was just as white as Greece and Rome were. Not even a question. Persia is now called Iran. I-R-A-N. Where did they get the name of Iran? From Aryan. Aryan is a reference to, essentially, most people know it from Germany, refer to themselves as Aryan, the Aryan superior race. But Aryans typically is a reference to tall, blonde, and red-haired, blue-eyed, light-skinned individuals. That's who ran the Persian empires. They were as white as the Greeks and the Romans. And so and that example is why it's called Iran, or Aryan, to this day, okay? So for him to say that the Greeks and the Romans thought the Persians were barbarians because anything otherwise was, I get that, was contrary to the natural order of white supremacy, it's propaganda. He's playing to your perception of what Iran is now, which ultimately, 1,000 years after this time period, okay, we're talking about 500 to 300 BCE, before Christ, around 700 AD, or about almost 1,000 years later, is when Iran or Persia became more of a brown-skinned place, and that's because of the conquests of the Islam, Nation of Islam, founded by, not the Nation of Islam, but the religion of Islam, founded by Muhammad, started a series of invasions, and Persia or Iran is one of those places that they attacked, and they wiped out all of the white people in Persia, killed most of the white men, and raped the white women, and as is done when invading armies come in, and they changed the complexion of Persian Iran. Prior to that, it was a white country. So he's completely misunderstanding what Persia was like back then. It was a white country. The Greeks and Roman were going, oh, ho, ho, those brown people. Persia was white too. It's just, it just makes no sense. But again, he's playing to the misperception of what everybody believes Persia or Iran looks like now, but it didn't look like that. Okay? So the concept was given voice by Charles Louis de Montesquieu in his Persian Letters of 1721. Liberty, he wrote, was intended for the genius of European races, and slavery for that of the Asiatics. Idiot thing for that person to say, but it was common back then. Almost all civilizations condemn rival civilizations. It's par for the course, regardless of the skin color or racial or genetic background of the founders of the civilization. The Scottish historian John Gillies expanded on his thought in 1787, maintaining that the Persians enslaved the Greeks of Asia Minor and for the first time threatened Europe with the terrors of Asiatic despotism. Across the decades and into new centuries, it became the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling put it, to spread the benefits of freedom-giving Hellenic culture all over the globe for the betterment of all races and to keep the barbarian at bay. Lots to unpack there. I'm just going to let that be at the moment. I won't, because not a lot to push back on. To repeat. In September 1889, George Nathaniel Curzon, a young British member of Parliament with a big destiny, began a 3-month tour of Persia, his sole visit to the country. As he strolled around Persepolis, he was moved by what he encountered regarding the ruins as a solemn lesson of the ages. The lesson, of course, was one of hubris. The Persians, he certified, were unable to understand that they did not have the qualities needed to maintain an empire, nor to govern it effectively. So he's saying this person was wrong, and he's absolutely right. That's absolutely ridiculous. The Persians had one of the longest-lived empires ever, and they grew, became an empire, it collapsed. Nomads would come in, take over the kingship, and then they would expand and create an empire, and it would collapse, and over again, new nomads would come in. That tends to be the pattern. But, if you assume that this growing and collapsing Persian empire is one empire, it lasted for thousands of years. They really had it. It was pretty incredible. And no empire is going to last for too long. Even Egypt was continually, fell and revivified over and over again. Persia's long decline and fall were inevitable, Curzon opined, but it needed a Greek of Alexander's stature to bring about its predestined end. Curzon noted in his stately 2-volume work, Persia and the Persian Question, often regarded as history's longest job application. The post was the coveted job of Viceroy of India, that he found Persian and Indian resistance to Western colonialization baffling. The normal Asiatic would sooner be misgoverned by Asiatics than well-governed by Europeans, he wrote, somewhat bewildered. Again, I'm not going to push back on this because, as I stated before, there's no question there's been demonization of other civilizations, and Eastern civilization as represented by our Near Eastern civilization as represented by Persia has been condemned by Western civilization, and one of the reasons why that is predominantly, I think, because of the perception of Persia as it is now as a brown-skinned nation. There's no question about it that there was racism, and I'm certain it had played a large part in the perception of Persia as it was then. They didn't know, I think, when these guys in the 1800s were talking, that Persia was an Aryan empire. I don't think they had a clue. To say the normal Asiatic would sooner be misgoverned by Asiatics and well governed by Europeans. And it's a time I actually discussed this too. This division of Asia and Europe, it's a silly division, and this division is made to be able to apply a misperception of history as well. There's no reason, to my perception, why Asia and Europe should be divided as different continents. It's only one continent. That's why you continue to hear this over and over again. They call it the Indo-European continents or the Asiatic European continents, massive continent, because it's all one land. Somewhere in the middle is the Ural Mountains, and that's typically used to separate Europe and Asia. Like there's the Ural Mountains in the middle, and then to the west of the Ural Mountains is Europe, and to the east of the Ural Mountains is Asia. Matter of fact, I'll throw up a map so you can see it there. The Ural, I'll try to make sure the Ural Mountains are prominent in there, and you can see where the Ural Mountains are. So you can see that acts as the dividing line between what's Europe and Asia. Why? Really, this is one continent, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not going to get into tectonic plates, and really, and they had no clue what tectonic plates either anyway when they made this division back then. So Asia and Europe are one big landmass. It really should be thought of as one continent, in my humble opinion. The reason they do that is because they want you to have a misperception of who Asiatics are. Because guess what? It's all Caucasian. When you think Asiatics, you think of the brown peoples, or Chinese and the Japanese, and so they're in the far, 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 far eastern part of Asia. But the predominant landmass of Asia, those were white peoples. And just as I showed with Persia, it was Aryan, it was white peoples prior to Muhammad conquering them or Islam conquering them. There's a people called the Yamnaya. What we found is these Yamnaya people, that's Yamnaya, and this is from DNA, they found this. When they started doing DNA investigation of how the Europeans came about, turns out Europe was like dark-skinned, blue-eyed peoples. And then people from Turkey came in the Turkey area, and they came in with agriculture, and they settled in, they mixed with the Europeans, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed Europeans. But then, around, I think it was 2000, 3000 BC, from Asia came these bearded peoples into Europe and just took over everything. And it's those bearded Yamnaya peoples who represented the vast predominance of the genetic heritage of the Europeans. So most of the European genetics comes from Asia, these Yamnaya from Asia. And what did they look like? Well, that's where the blonde-haired and red-haired genetic aspects come from. The blonde-haired, red-haired, blue eyes, all these genetic traits come from the Yamnaya. They brought them into Europe. And it's one of the reasons why Europe has so many blue-eyed, because it's a recessive gene, but you also had the dark-haired blue-eyeds who were the original Europeans, and then the Yamnaya came in with their recessive blue-eye genes too, and it added to the blue-eyed aspects of Europe. So, but my whole point in this is that Asia's Caucasian, but they're trying to get you to think of Europeans and Asians as different genetically, when in fact there's Europeans, most Asians, particularly the vast land, huge land mass of Asia that is Central and Western Asia is Caucasian, and they're just the cousins to Europeans. There's very little genetic differences. Curzon was a successful product of the locus classicus of a distinctly British form of Philhellenism, the English elite public school system. These all-male institutions, factories of privilege, where senior judges, top civil servants, and foreign office diplomats were conveyor belt manufacturers, traditionally embedded classics at the core of their curricula. Ancient Greek language and literature were considered the cornerstones of education, and Greek was used to inculcate the next generation of Britain's imperial administrators. This is where you can see the ridiculous nature of this leftist professor's perception in these all-male institutions, factories of privilege. These are propaganda terms. There were all-female institutions too in English, the English elite public school system. I would point out that I don't think any nation in the world has had more female rulers. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mary was of the Scots, but I'm pretty certain Queen Mary was English as well, English ruler. But Queen Elizabeth II, I think it was Queen Elizabeth II. My knowledge of the monarchs of England is a little bit sketchy, but I know that they've had various female rulers throughout their history, and even up to modern day. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of England. She was a very successful Prime Minister of England, and she was conservative as well. So this suggestion that these all-male institutions, factories of privilege, Western civilization has a long history of fostering female leadership where appropriate. And females have taken a long history of leading Western nations. So it's silly that he does that, especially with regard to England, which has had so many female rulers. And they have all male institutions too. And factors of privilege, again, for the most part, these institutions were based on your abilities as well. Certainly, genetics, or if you're not even genetics, but family history. If your family join this particular school, your father did, then you have more likely, or you're going to get in. No question. Well, that's because of genetics. One, they assume you may be as smart as your dad, or even smarter, which of course isn't the case. But to call it factors of privilege is really ridiculous. And what it shows is in particular, a resentment. I think it's hard to qualify such a perception where you call places factories of privilege. Why would you do that? People who don't have the capacity to succeed in these higher education institutions are allowed to get into these institutions, and it lowers the level of the institutions. That's what's happening in college with colleges. It has nothing to do with the color of the participants in college, but it has to do with that all of a sudden we're going to, these are factors of privilege. We're going to let any idiot get into college, and then all of a sudden, smart guy, is sitting next to the idiot over here, and they have to slow down the entire class so this idiot next to me is able to figure things out. It lowers the quality of the education for everybody. So that's why it's factories of privilege. It's just resentment. People who are too stupid to realize how systems work and how a system that rewards competence is one that is going to be able to make life better for everybody. And a system of competence is something that those who argue and call, oh, it's privilege. No, it's competence. People with competence they confuse competence and privilege, unfortunately. There's an overlap there. There certainly is examples of privilege that shouldn't happen, but they make this broad, big case where everything is privilege, and no, a lot of it is competence. Let's continue on. We consider the cornerstones. We're going to go to the next aspect here. Significantly, knowledge of Greek language and history circulated only among the most privileged of Britain's mostly male elite. Again, notice that he had to say mostly male because no nation has had more female rulers, I think, than Britain. And the Greeks were brilliant, of course. There's no question that it should be, and that's what's wrong with colleges nowadays, and high schools too. They're not being taught the Greek classics, and that's one of the reasons why, other than what I stated before on the last page, it's one of the many reasons why people are failing, schools are failing, because they're not teaching the basis of which our civilization stem from. And there's not a question that the Greeks and the Romans as well are what our civilization is are the foundations upon which our civilization rests. And if you don't study the foundations upon which our civilization rests, you tempt fate and the possibility of having that civilization collapse, which is what we're rushing towards at this point right now. We'll continue. Winston Churchill famously said that he would allow schoolboys to learn Latin as an honor and Greek as a treat. Yet sitting behind his familiar bon mot was Churchill's commitment to the use of the classics as a means of social distancing. It was a powerful device which could be relied upon to keep the classes well apart and, by extension, add to the processes of empire building by initiating only the top brass of society into its mysteries. The classicists, I'm going to stop right there because I want to, yes, in England there was this hierarchy, there was a hierarchy, and it was hard to move up. Not a doubt about it, where he talks about factories of privilege, that there's no question that there was this aspect of privilege that was inculcated into English society back then. And guess what? A lot of them left, that's why a lot of them came to the United States, because the United States has always been a place where no matter how you're born, where you're born, who you're born to, no matter your skin color, no matter your religion, no matter your race, no matter anything, if you are competent and able to succeed in your field, you will succeed in life. For the most part, as long as an oppressive government isn't stomping on your boot, as has happened lately to our American peoples, unfortunately. So this criticism of Western civilization in general is wrong. Yes, there was this much more frozen system of hierarchy in England, but that's why they all came to the United States. Let's continue. Right here. The classicist H.D.F. Kiddo, himself a product of the British public education system, and the author of a still best-selling 1951 Introduction to Greek History, invited his readers to accept as a reasonable statement of fact that the Greeks had a totally new conception of what human life was for, and showed for the first time what the human mind was for. Yeah, I mean, if you read Plato and Socrates, which I have a little bit, I'm not fully versed in the classics as I should be, because I wasn't raised with them, unfortunately. They had been cast aside, and it's mostly my own readings, very limited. Why I understand that, but yeah, there's no question. That's a true statement, whether you like it or not. Now, don't get me wrong; those same elements came from Persia too, and there were the Achaemenid portion of Greece, which I think is almost a shared border with Persia. I may be wrong about that. Greek, and then Achaemenid, and then Persia, I think is the way it goes. A lot of the great thinkers came from there too, and were very Persian influenced. And there was a lot of Persian classics as well that have been lost to time, unfortunately. But the division between Persia and Greece is very limited because they had so much of an influence upon each other. While they were all enemies, they were also knew each other very well and shared a very similar culture. And they were cousins essentially. They stemmed from the same root in Asia, which I was talking about before, the Amnaya peoples. The Greeks were mostly blonde, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and same with the Persians, at least the ruling class in Persia. It was an empire, and any empire that expands, they're going to be many ethnicities, and that's the nature of empire. So let's continue. What has emerged from this long legacy of imperialized Philhellenism is a series of damaging premises and a harmful conclusion. That classical Greece was an exceptional moment in world history, and it was, and that the West has unquestionably benefited from being the heir to Greek culture, which it has. That legacy has shaped national histories. Writing in 1867, the British philosopher and political economist John Stuart Mill claimed that even as an event in British history, the Battle of Marathon, fought between the Greeks and the Persians in 490 BCE, is more important than the Battle of Hastings. He declared that the true ancestors of the European nations are not those from whose blood they are sprung, but those from whom they derive the richest portion of their inheritance. Essentially what this author is trying to say here is, what he's getting at is that Persia was a source of great ideas as well, and it was, there's no question about it. But the difference is that a lot of that has been lost to history, unfortunately, given the ravages of the empire that these numerous Persian empires fell and lost. And so a lot of their writings and their history is lost to time. Westerners saw themselves as the direct heirs of the miracle of Greek civilization. It was logical for them to thereby affirm that Western culture must be exceptional too. By deduction, cultures deprived of the legacy of classical Hellenism had to be lesser civilizations in terms of rational thought and governance, unity of purpose, intelligence, and ambition. The old Greek image of a decadent and despotic Persia was repurposed to represent the inadequacies and inabilities of all non-Europeans. Again, I would just point to the fact that there was no distinctive difference between Persians and Greeks and Europeans, all the same person, all Caucasians. So he's trying to see what he's doing here is appealing to your perception of Persia as a brown country, which it wasn't back then. It was a white country. Aryan. Okay. This perverse understanding of a hierarchy of cultural competence is still propounded. An eminent German scholar of the Greco-Roman world, Hermann Bunkston, for example, has rooted his academic career in promoting this hackneyed myth of Western superiority. He recently found the compulsion to write that, look, this hackneyed myth of Western superiority, every single nation in the world has a Western culture now. Okay? It's not a question. Japan, Western culture. China, Western culture. That's why they've had such success the past 70 years, 60, no, I'll say 50 years. Since 1970, once they opened themselves up to the West, boom, they were successful too. Previous to that, they had a lot of problems. Russia, Europe, United States, North America, South America, all of them are part of Western culture at this point. They drive cars, they fly planes, they have governments that are based on democracy, which came from Greece. The author has a complete misunderstanding of world history and how we got to this point. Western culture predominates everywhere you go, no matter what. India as well. I forgot to mention India. The ramifications of the Greek triumph over the Persians are almost incalculable. By repulsing the assault of the East, the Hellenes charted the political and cultural development of the West. With the triumphant struggle for liberty by the Greeks, Europe was first born, both as a concept and as a reality. The freedom which permitted Greek culture to rise to the classical models in art, drama, philosophy, and historiography, Europe owes to those who fought at Salamis and Plataea. If we regard ourselves today as free-thinking people, it is the Greeks who created the condition for this. We can add to this voice the voice of Andrew Bayliss, a historian at Birmingham University, who in 2020, on the anniversary of the Battle of Thermopylae, fought in 480 BCE between Xerxes' Persians and the combined forces of the Greek city-states, advocated that Thermopylae's greatest legacy was the so-called Golden Age. Had the Persians succeeded in... Did I just miss something there? I think I may have missed something. I actually missed a quote. Sorry about that. I'll have to continue. Had the Persians succeeded in permanently destroying Athens, they would have snuffed out the fledgling Athenian democracy, and we would not today marvel at the magnificence of the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis, or be able to read the great works of literature by the likes of Thucydides, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and Plato. None of this would have been possible without the inspiration that the Spartan king Leonidas and his men provided in their stand for freedom. Yeah, the reason we know about Greece is that the Persians did not succeed in destroying Athens. No question about it. Let's move on. And one of the reasons why we don't know, she's right. We don't have as much of the wealth of Persian knowledge that came from Persia is because they were wiped out, and their Persepolis, I think, was destroyed. I think that Persepolis, which he mentions earlier, if I remember correctly, those are ruins. There is no Persepolis in Iran where the people are walking down the streets of Persepolis. It's a ruined nation. Ruined city-state that was excavated later on, and people can go visit it, but there's nobody living there. If I'm right, I'll try to throw up a link, and if I'm wrong, I'll correct myself with a link, just to make sure I stay on the right side of facts, something leftists don't do, and I'm a liberal. These sentiments are as flawed as they are spurious. The Persians were never out to destroy democracy, whatever democracy means in its ancient context. Again, it's just silly to even write that, but I'm going to move on. In fact, many Ionian Greek city-states, I talked about the Ionian mode before with music, continued to practice democracy under Persian rule. After all, the Persians recognized the Ionian Greeks' dislike of autocratic tyrants, and they happily replaced them with democracies. Had the Achaemenids brought the mainland Greeks into their empire, they doubtless would have tolerated democracy there as well. They might have even encouraged it. A Persian victory, a Persian victory of Sparta, the most oppressive. I messed up somehow. These sentiments are as far as the Persians were never out to Jerusalem. In fact, many they would have. A Persian victory. This is a duplicate. Sorry about that. A Persian victory over Sparta, the most oppressive, freedom-denying slave state of antiquity, would have been a win for liberty. It would have put an end to Sparta's terrorist-like hold over the rest of Greece. The idea that the Persians inhibited and held back Europe's cultural development is absurd. Fully agreed. Since the era of the Greco-Persian Wars, the Persians themselves have been at the receiving end of a historiographic smear campaign in which they have been cast as the tyrannical oppressors of the free world. The Western intellectual commitment to the promotion of its own supposed singularity and superiority has been very damaging for the study of Persia's history. It is time to rectify the long-standing injurious distortion that the Persians have suffered by giving ear to a genuine ancient Persian voice. I agree with that, fully agree with that. The problem is that he tries to make it a subject of white supremacy or the fact that it's it's Western civilization condemning the Asiatics. No, that's not what happened. It's not what happened at all. And in fact, Persians were white. So here's his book. Encourage you to read it. I haven't read it, unfortunately, but it looks like it'd be very interesting. Lots of interesting facts, no question about it. Lots to push back on as well, since he's a leftist professor, but that's the way it is in most colleges nowadays. And once again, it was Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. The book is Persians, The Age of the Great Kings. And he's right, though. Persia, the influence of Persia on modern-day society and history is not given the attention that it desires, because these were great empires, great peoples, and very learned, and a lot of great things came from these Persian empires. And they were descendants of, I've mentioned the Yamnaya. And the Yamnaya are what we call the 2000 to 3000 BC peoples who spread out over the entire world. First it was Europe and India and Persia that they took over. Eventually it spread to North America, South America. So these Yamnaya ultimately have conquered the world. But the Yamnaya descendants were what's called Scythians, Scythians. I'll throw up a video to the Scythians so you can learn about the Scythians. Scythians were right outside of Persia. And I've mentioned how Persian Empire continually collapsed and was revivified. It was revivified because these nomads would take over, and the nomads were the Scythians. These were blondes, tall blondes, blue-eyed, also blonde and red-haired nomadic peoples who are responsible for most civilizations throughout the world. Ultimately, all civilization comes from them. Thanks for watching, everybody. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. would love to hear what you have to say about some of what I said. I hope to have a new video out for you very soon. Thanks for watching, listening, and my apologies for my stammering a bit on this. It's early in the morning here, so it takes me a couple hours to wake up fully. Thanks for watching.